Hello, welcome to In Good Company with Impact. My name's Dan Jones and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Richard Little, who is a professor at the Institute for Leadership and Sustainability. But we know Richard because he worked for Impact for almost 40 years, working as a senior consultant with clients in every sector, business, non-for-profit and public. And Richard was pivotal to developing Impact's approach particularly to our proposition around leadership. And as we start this series of podcasts and asking people around the world about their experiences of leadership, we thought there was no better person to start this series with. So Richard, thank you very much for joining us in this rather cold boathouse today. But we thought it was an appropriate place to do our interview because this is essentially one of the birthplace, if you like, of Impact, or back in the early 80s. So we thought where better to start with the lapping of the water there, with the boat rocking away. And so I just want to start with this. So allegedly you retired from Impact a couple of years ago, but we still see a lot of you. And I'd like to learn a bit more about you. So tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Okay, I'll try. Primary school, thrashed on my first day. Hands out, little. And later got expelled from comprehensive school, went to a progressive school where I was asked to leave, went to art college, 1969, refused to accept my degree, organised a student protest and walked out. Went to the University of Leeds but didn't finish there either. I was taught there by Zygmunt Bauman, which is almost certainly the most influential single human being in my life. Formed a theatre company, that lasted 10 years, went to Exeter University, didn't get thrown out of Exeter University, became the president of the Students' Union, dallied for a while with the National Union of Students, and then came to Impact, more or less by mistake. Had no intention of staying, but possibly they drugged me and kidnapped me. Anyway, I did stay. I stayed for 40 years. In that 40 years, I suppose that some things happened that were... in 1988, I went out to Japan, was the first country manager of our office there. That was fantastic. And Japan is still my second home. And in 1999, we founded the Master's degree in Developmental Education at the University, the then University College St. Martin. 2008, Dave allowed me, or encouraged me, or supported me while campaigning to keep the university, what was the Charlotte Mason campus, open at Ambleside, which was a big thing at the time. That became the Institute for Leadership and Sustainability. I'm still involved there. I think I'm still on the books. Not quite sure. That was. I'm coming to the close now, and now I spend most of my. I mean, obviously, I have a lot more time to do the gardening, and I spend a lot of time looking for my glasses and trying to control my hair, yeah. What else? Oh, and I've got I've just started a new job at a university in Poland, WSB, but I'm not exactly sure what they expect me to do.
So you're here today to join us because you're credited through creating Impact's proposition to leadership. And I'm sure that you'll say it wasn't entirely down to you. But can you explain how we came to approach leadership as action, specifically what notice, decide, act means?
Well, first of all, I mean, this won't mean anything to anybody outside Impact, but it's important to acknowledge the fact that this was a collective effort. I think the big thing that got things going was 1984 when Dave Williams asked me and Jonathan Lago to write a brochure for Impact. Writing a brochure is one thing, but in fact, in order to write a brochure, you have to have some idea of what it is you're doing. And of course, Impact had a shtick, and we did what we did, and it was fine. But Jonathan and I worked incredibly intensely together. We were locked in a room, literally locked in a room. Well, not literally locked in a room, but almost locked in a room. We were stuck in a room for hours on end doing this. And we thrashed out quite a lot of the shape of what Impact became. Constantly feeding things back to Dave Williams, helped by the designer, Martin Gallagher, who later joined Impact. Part of that was deciding that we would progressively migrate towards a consulting firm rather than a sales-based product training company. In order to do that, we needed to know what it was we were trying to achieve for our clients, and there was one absolutely central commitment, that was to experiential education. We were an experiential learning company, and that's how Dave and his then partner Paul Broom had started the company, and that's what we were committed to continue. And that, to some extent, determines what it is you do and how you do it. There are things you can't do, but far better than thinking about what you can't do, we followed the logic of what we could do, and we followed it further. I think we followed it further than anybody else in the field had done at the time. And we were in touch with, I was at the time, shortly after that, joined a national scheme to produce standards for experiential education, along with Chris Loynes and various other people, and I can't remember his name now. So we knew what was going on in our field, and we knew that we were different, and we became progressively more different as time went on. A second thing was, it became obvious to us that leadership was salient in the field at the time. It hadn't always been. The idea of leaders in business was relatively new. In fact, you can date it. You can precisely date it to an article by a man called Zalesnik in Harvard Business Review in 1977, and I think it was titled, "Are your managers leaders?" or something like that. And this kind of triggered a popular literature of leadership that hasn't stopped since. It's difficult to imagine now that the idea of leadership in business simply had no currency before that. Nobody talked about leadership in business. They talked about management development and organization development, so we kind of decided that leadership was the thing we were going to go for. So we needed the fundamental basis of the leadership proposition was it had to meet three conditions. The first was it had to be something that was practicable, something that we had to be developing things that could actually be developed, rather than a kind of neoliberal fantasy of potency, a sort of wish fulfillment fantasy of being visionary and authentic and all that kind of stuff. It needed to be real. We actually had to develop capacities that were reliably likely to be the precursors to leadership. The second condition was that it had to be aligned with experiential education methods. That actually was the clue that gave us the method. Because if you're working experientially, whatever that means, it can mean an awful lot of different things, but questions of personality are somewhat beyond the scope of experiential education. You have to deal with what you can see and what's actually happening in front of you with groups and people in real situations as far as possible. So those were two conditions. The third condition was a personal one for me, and that was that having come to the idea of leadership rather late and being rather allergic to the idea of leadership, having spent most of my life up to that date antagonizing authority in every form possibly could, at school and beyond. Leadership was part of a concept of authority and power that I found rather alienating. I was later to discover that almost everybody else did too. But I was appalled by what I found in the popular literature of leadership. The endless lists of traits and recipes for leadership and 10 things to be and 5 things to do and so on. It just seemed like so much baby talk to me. And so I wanted to redeem the idea of leadership and restore it away from this masculinized fantasy of supremacy and ascendancy towards something that was more in the moment, something that was more accessible, something that anybody could feel that they had access to or the capacity for. And the crucial moment was something very, very simple, and that was realizing that we weren't dealing with leadership as position or role or power relation. Well, power relation would come into it, but or personality. We're dealing with leadership as a moment of action. And the really simple idea was we used our method, which was already established, to capture moments in which people did things that might be construed as leadership. It didn't matter who they were, it didn't matter whether they were the boss or the humblest member of a group or team. They might do something or say something that later other people could agree was leadership or something like leadership. It didn't really matter whether you called it leadership or not. Because one of the features of leadership to me is that it always disappears. It's always capable of being described as something else. It might be decisiveness or courage or stepping up. Or there's always a more concrete way of describing what happens when leadership is manifest in, say, an organization or a group. So we followed the logic of that idea for several years. Jonathan Lego and I were very, very close in developing this idea. And the relationship was I would propose absurdly over-intellectualized ideas and he would drag them back into some kind of sensible reality. Later, Maggie Pierce, Maggie Henderson as she then was, became a third party in that process. And I think Jonathan and Maggie were the most innovative and creative subgroup in Impact's history for a while, probably in the mid-90s. Extraordinary fecundity. And that in turn was encouraged by a contract we had with Swiss Re, which was a remarkably encouraging client. Gave us an enormous amount of space to develop new ideas, new ways of doing things. I was familiar with Aristotle's notions of power and authority, auctoritas and so on. And he used a particular word or idea to describe the capacity for leadership, and he called it phronesis. And it's somewhat more current now than it was then, but phronesis seemed to me to be an extraordinarily useful idea. Aristotle meant practical wisdom, as opposed to Sophia, which is a sort of rather more intellectual. It was the ability to see what was going on around you and respond appropriately. And phronesis is clearly, some people have got it, but it's perfectly possible you can also develop the capacity for this kind of awareness, this kind of consciousness and propensity for action. And to put it at its simplest, I would argue that it has three elements. The first is a robust ability to interpret what's going on around you, not necessarily correctly, but operationally, to the extent that you know that you can do something. Secondly, the ability to monitor one's own state and response to what's going on around you, so that you don't necessarily. It's a bit like impulse control, which is sort of standard of leadership theory. And the third is having a propensity to act. And having a propensity to act is not necessarily a good thing. It depends whether you're acting appropriately or wisely or sensibly in the circumstances, or more to the point, whether your action is seen as legitimate. So we needed to flesh out this idea in all directions. And the model that we've got now, which Impact is, I think, still using, is summarized as notice, decide, act. And that's an attempt to kind of open up the moment of action and, as it were, anatomatize it and see what's in it in that tiny fraction of a second when you decide to do something. We wanted to be able to develop this capacity, which was an outward awareness, an inner awareness, and a propensity to act. Not because that is leadership, but because that seems to be one of the precursors of leadership, or one of the capacities that might enable people to be more, to take the initiative more, to put it simply. There's a great American sociologist, C. Wright Mills, Charles Mills. I was strongly influenced by him when I was in my teens. And he said that there was a particular cast of mind, which he called the sociological imagination. And the sociological imagination is, as he put it, is the ability to see the wider social forces at work in the surface phenomena of life. And you might say that it's the opposite of radical individualism. It's recognizing that everybody exists in a social context. Everybody's self is constituted through others in language. Ourselves are extended socially in language. And it's a very restricted imagination that can't see that people are to some extent at the mercy of larger social forces, economic forces, ideology. And this connects to notice, decide, act, because one of the things you might notice is that the surface phenomena that you're responding to is evidence of a wider organizational pathology. So that in turn translates into what one might call a critical imagination, not just a sociological imagination, but a moral imagination. And it seems to me to be the case that if leadership means anything, is inescapably moral. In fact, I would argue, and have argued in a recent paper, that management is also inescapably moral. There's a wonderful paper by Alverson and Svenningsson about the day-to-day reality of management and how it doesn't match the rhetoric of management. And a manager in an organization is always trying to balance expediency and principle, the demands of profit-making and the demands of the human reality of the people in front of her or him. So it's not completely fair to say that leadership is moral and management isn't, but leadership is only moral. Yeah. It's only about important things. There's no such thing as a trivial leadership. I mean, a really good example of the way that leadership is infantilized and trivialized and routinized is something I heard on the radio a couple of weeks ago. It was about a large distribution company whose name shall remain unspoken. A huge distribution warehouse, and somebody was describing anonymously their working life. And the question was, are you really supervised when you go to the toilet? And he said, well, you sort of are and you aren't. You know, you might go to the lavatory and be aware that a leader is checking to make sure you're not there for very long. And the key thing in that was the fact that the word leader is routinely used in that context. Mm. Leadership is not about, I mean, that's being a creep, not being a leader. And leadership is too easily recruited as something that it should never be, as something diminished, desacralized. And that was part of the original intention of redeeming leadership, redeeming the idea of leadership, bringing it back from this trivialization in the business literature. So Notice, Decide, Act is in part about raising people's moral awareness of their duties as human beings, not as employees, not as managers, not as leaders, not as anything, but as people, without reference to the as it were, the more localized organizational norms and regulations and rules and conditions, enlarging people's horizon for action.
Why do you think Notice, Decide, Act has stood the test of time?
I don't know. My experience tells me that when you're working with people on a program commissioned by a client, that if people respond to an idea and find it makes sense in the context of their real working lives, then you're onto a winner. When it's, I mean, I've given a very bad account of Notice, Decide, Act. I think, if one was doing it, if I was doing it with a client, with people, real people in front of me, and we're trying to actually do something about their workplace and their experience of work and their lives and careers, then it would be rooted in the actualities, the realities of what they were doing and where they were. But there's another principle involved here, and that's what I call, in impact, the totality principle, which is that in impact, by and large, we would run programs. A group of people would come along, or we would go to them, and we'd do things, talk to them, have them talk, do exercises, all kinds of stuff. And it's tempting to suppose that we're doing practical exercises in which people are thinking about something like Notice, Decide, Act, for instance, or the other plank of the leadership proposition, meaning, value, and structure, as a sort of heuristic for thinking about organizations. But actually, it doesn't mean anything unless the totality of the experience is the object of the inquiry. Not just the exercise you're doing, but the totality of the relationship between the people in the group and the facilitator, the people in the group and their employer, the commissioning employer. Everything is part of the process of unlearning about organizations and relearning new ways of being. I mean, I'll give you an example. This is a real example, not from work with a client, but work with a group of associates who came to Impact for some sort of training. They went off in the evening to a mountain hut, and they were talking about the day. And one of them said, well, we did that exercise this morning. Frankly, I thought it was stupid. I thought it was a waste of time. And Sally made the obvious point, that, well, why didn't you say that at the time? Because the totality of the experience is up for grabs. Everything that happens here is the arena in which we look at leadership, your behavior, your relations, your relationship to power, including my power as her power, Sally's power. At the time, the point was vigorously resisted. It's like, how dare you? You told us to do it. But she carried the point. And that's always been an absolutely central plank of work in impact. And it's one that I am afraid is observed in the breach quite often. I worry about it, about people remembering that, or having the resources or the presence of mind to use it.
So, a bit more of a personal question this. As somebody who's developed and coached and lectured thousands of people in your career, what would you say has been your most memorable learning experience?
Okay. Well, I'm going to be controversial again and say that I immediately bridle at the notion of a learning experience, just as I dislike the term lived experience, which rather raises the question of what we mean by experience. Learning isn't something commodifiable or able to be reduced to little lumps of stuff. You might be able to say, well, I learned 10 new words in French today, and I've only forgotten 3 since, so I'm 7 up. But when you're learning about human interaction, organization, the infinite subtleties and complexities of life with other people, you learn, you forget, you relearn, you fail to understand, you understand. It's just a continuous, perpetual process that is very like being alive. And I would rather use the term associated with Freud's colleague Otto Rank, who, I don't think he coined the term, but he said that unlearning was infinitely more important than learning. We grow up with all kinds of assumptions one of the things Freud described as the mine is best fantasy, which, primitive nationalism is just the mine is best taken to its logical conclusion. And each of these things needs somehow to be unlearned in the face of direct experience of the complexities of life. So for me, the most important experiences are unlearning. I have my own, and I only thought about this morning. My own is a very unfashionable form of learning or unlearning, and that's reading books. When I was 18, I had a copy of the Philosophical Investigations by Wittgenstein in translation, in parallel text by Elizabeth Anscombe. I've still got it. And I read it one summer. And it's a notoriously difficult text. And God knows what I made of it 60 years ago, 50 years ago. But it's also, as the so-called resolute reading of philosophical investigation, it's a self-cancelling text. If you get to the end and you've understood it, then you've understood that the entire text doesn't make any sense at all, to put it crudely. And that book completely changed my life. I was never able to think in the same way again. I was never able not to be critical of what I heard and saw, in the sense of accepting the underlying assumptions of what was being said or what was being argued. It introduced me to the idea of an extended argument. There's another great, I forgot, his name won't come, an American philosopher who said of the same book, the first line of Philosophical Investigations, the most famous line in the language turn in philosophy, and it's the world is everything that is the case. And a lot of people get stuck on the first line, the first sentence, and there are acres of interpretation of that line. But actually, the whole book is the interpretation of that line. And what that taught me, in addition, was that, as the highly controversial Dutch philosopher Sloterdijk says, the only valid argument is at least book length. Nothing shorter will do. And so I'm deeply suspicious of a world in which people repugn books, in which they insist that you can learn more from a 3-minute read than you can from a lifetime of reading. The most important salutary experiences of my life have been in books. Which isn't to derogate direct human encounter. Of course, I'm learning all the time from the people around me in life, but without that framework, without those tools for thinking, I wouldn't have ever got anywhere. So that's my most important and vivid and memorable learning experience, and always will be.
So finally, Richard, we're gonna finish up with a question that we're going to ask every guest on this series, which is, if you were starting over, what's the best piece of advice you would give yourself?
Okay. Well, if I was advising the 18-year-old me, I'd say 2 things. First of all, don't unnecessarily antagonize people in authority. 3 piece of advice. 2, always necessarily antagonize people in authority, because sometimes you have a duty to do that. And thirdly, I was 18, it was just after the Cuba Missile Crisis, and I expected to die in a nuclear war, along with most of my generation. And I would, if I could send a message back to my 18-year-old self, it would be, you're still going to be around in 2023. You'd better start planning your life. It's not going to end in a flash. And the other most important, vital piece of advice I'd give myself is, if I was going back to my 40-year-old self, I'd say, don't worry, hang in there. Your glasses are going to be fashionable again in the 2020s.
I think that's pretty good advice.
Thank you.
Well, Richard, thank you very much, and thank you for enduring the, as we've mentioned, rather cold boathouse. We didn't expect it to be this cold today, but it has been. But it's been an experience. So thank you very much.
It's only -10.
Yeah, it's something around there. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been great.